His response was very interesting because he was like, well, how do you know all this about your mother? And my reply to him was like, I just know. It's like God tells me.
Ooh.
He looked alarmed when I said that. And he looked at my father, who had given this very like dispassionate Englishman
Logical
answer. And he looked at me and I'd given him this kind of spiritual answer. And he looked back at my dad like, she's next.
Wow.
Yeah. Roots and rigor, rigor and flow. Roots and rigor, rigor and flow. Roots and rigor, rigor and flow. Rigor and flow.
1. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, madame.
How are you, Tamanda?
I'm very delighted to see you.
I'm delighted to see you too. And we are back with Rigor and Flow.
With Aiwan and Tamanda.
It's the place where business meets love and
Culture meets critique.
yes. So, what do we have on today?
When is a mental health issue actually a mental health issue, as opposed to an expression of culture or even religion?
So, what do you mean when you say an expression of culture?
Okay, so what I mean by that is, I'll give you a really good example of this that I saw recently. It was actually on a reel on Instagram. There was a black nurse working in, I think, maternal health services. And she had come onto ward one day and she was describing her experiences of receiving a handover from white colleagues about a black woman patient. And in the notes, these white colleagues had said, we think there needs to be a referral to, I guess, to maternal mental health services for this woman. And we're concerned about her self-harming behavior. So she saw these notes as a black woman and she was like, okay, I'm going to inquire what on earth is going on here. And her colleague said to her when she inquired that this woman had been lying in bed, sort of banging her head and tapping her head really hard. What's the first thing you think when I explain that?
Well, that she might have an itchy scalp.
That's exactly what was happening.
Yeah.
Basically, this woman had braids and she's doing what we all do as black women.
Yeah.
Scratching her scalp by like patting her head.
Yeah, like when I get my dreads done, especially when I get them in a style and it's tight, it's just itchy.
Yeah.
Because you've also got all of the creams and stuff as well.
Yep.
And so, yeah, you just tap your head like that.
Exactly.
It's actually quite a nice percussive sound, to be honest. I should sample it.
Said like a true soundy.
Yeah.
It's true. But you and I would read that behavior, like it's culturally normal for us as
Absolutely.
black women. We all know that. But for the white women whose care she was in, they read that as this woman is not okay. She's self-harming.
Why didn't
she's
they ask
sick.
her? Like,
that's a very good, we'll get into what happens within mental health services and all the stuff I've seen in projects that I've been involved with to date. But the bottom line was they read that as an expression of mental ill health. And so what they were looking to do, probably with good intentions, was make a referral to her to a professional that could, I don't know, a mental health services professional. So that's the kind of thing I mean when I ask.
That's what you mean. Okay. Are there any other examples that you can think of?
I mean, I think there's tons, but maybe actually let me talk about one of my favorite, like an author I really, really liked at some point, where I've always found this like this fascinating mix of religion and culture and maybe just hinting at mental health stuff, is Paulo Coelho. Now, so he famously wrote The Alchemist. He's written tons of books. But in one of his books, I believe it's The Witch of Portobello, he has a woman, a character called Athena in it. And she's sort of Sufi mystic. And she does a lot of dancing. So I think it kind of hints at the whirling dervishes. And in it, there's always this lie or this kind of representation of dance as like an existential crisis and seeking for spiritual wholeness. And again, in that kind of cultural context, like dancing and in that kind of way might be seen as, same as in Western African traditions, in a lot of our African indigenous traditions. I've even heard about it in Native American traditions. That's seen as normal behavior. But if you looked at it through the lens of maybe say white European people, you'd be looking at people dancing around and moving as a spiritual practice or as a form of wholeness. And you'd be like, are these people, like in Africa, we got called savages for that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know? I mean, if you saw someone whirling around in the middle of the city centre, you'd be like, well, he's obviously tweaking on drugs.
Yeah, he's on, what is he on?
He's not quite right.
Yeah.
What's he on?
Yeah, exactly. We have rain.
Yeah. So what you can hear in the background is the rain hitting the roof, just in case you're listening on headphones and wondering what happened.
On. Yeah. So can you think of, can you relate to that, the thing I've explained about culture being read as an example of mental health?
Definitely. I saw something similar with my mum when she was in hospital, where religion played out with mental health in that scenario. But for now, I really want to focus on your story, which is a very, very personal story.
Yeah.
And has to do with your own family's experiences with serious mental health diagnoses, your mum specifically. I guess before we get into her situation, it'd be really good if you could paint a picture of your mum and what she was like sort of growing up.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So I would say I'll start with what was she like growing up and who is she as the woman I know today? I would say they're fairly different. But the person I knew, so my memories of my mum were someone who was very preoccupied with work, extremely driven. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
I'm glad you said it. I am glad you said it.
Yeah, she's very much like a go-getter, strong African woman, but excessively preoccupied with work. It to an extent that I felt, I mean, I didn't know that at the time, but it was unhealthy, I would have thought. Like she was quite unavailable because of it. So I have like very strong memories of being raised by my father and my aunt. My father's a teacher and very nurturing, very present person by his nature. And my aunt lived in the family home and actually worked for the family. So she basically raised me, and she was around when my mum was often studying away or working long hours running this environmental NGO that she ran. Or she was studying abroad in Scotland when I was really young. And then she started a PhD at some point in my childhood, and she was just very busy and very obsessed with trees. She's somebody who has like special interests, is fixated. Hers are trees, the environment. And if I remember her being present, it was to take us off to plant trees at the weekends as kids. Which is nice.
That sounds really beautiful because it's like a connection to nature.
Yeah.
And I feel like she's passed on, I think, that love of the environment and people in the environment and how they interact onto you. Weirdly, because I do see elements of it. I know you do sociology, but I feel like it's fueled by the same energy that fueled your mum.
Yeah, I am literally my mother's child.
Or that fuels your mum.
Yeah, definitely. But I think, you have to also, I think, mine's sociology and shaped by the things that impacted my life, and race, sociology of race is not a surprise because of the way I grew up. But my mum's interests in environment are definitely 100% shaped by, she was one of 14 kids. She was the seventh born of 14 kids, in fact, which in her family, going back 6 or 7 generations, the seventh born was the healer. Ooh. In their family setup. And of course...
on what side of the family does that pass down through?
I think it was on her...
paternal?
I think it was on her mother's side, but I'm not 100% sure. Okay. But what I know is that she grew up like very close to the land. She was, like many people in Botswana at the time, a subsistence farming family. We had our cattle in those days. You worked the land. It's a drought country. So much of her work in environmentalism and her desire in life, what she did her PhD around, was trying to figure out a way for families to survive drought years. And it's because, I believe, of massive food scarcity that she faced as a kid. Like she there'd be years where it wasn't that easy to eat. And so she kind of grew up working the lands. They had a Catholic missionary school in her village. She would walk her 10 and 20 kilometer journeys to the lands before school, work the lands.
So she's an African parent who actually did walk 10
actually
kilometers, fought a lion, fed the whole village, collected water, and then went to school.
She is that, basically. She is that.
I salute you, Ma Walker.
But yeah, I do think that some of that needing to survive showed up in her energy and how she worked, when she was older as an adult, and she was now raising me. When I say she worked feverishly, I feel like that was a lot of unaddressed, probably trauma and survival instincts just playing out in a place where it was no longer necessary.
Did you ever get any inklings that maybe something wasn't quite right?
Well, did I get inklings? I don't think I picked up when I was young that her approach to work was maybe an indication of something. I didn't feel like she was even absent. I felt like I had all my needs met between my dad, my aunt, and even her when she was around. So I didn't pick that up. But I think there were probably things along the way that you look back at and that I remembered as a child, right? Like I remember one time we got broken into several times in our house growing up. And I remember one time my parents were having this conversation about like how secure are we? We have like alarms and a security system, but if we keep getting broken into, do we need to start doing something different? And one day my mum was telling me that they were having this conversation and she said, I think we should get a gun, but your dad thinks I shouldn't have a gun because I might do something to myself. Okay. So that would be the kind of thing that, she would make as like a flippant or innocuous comment as a kid. But I'd be like, I guess I had this sense that she might not be safe, essentially, and that I had to be responsible for her. And I would say in general, she would always come to me for advice about big decisions, whether it was taking a job or moving house. So I could tell emotionally she was kind of fragile, I would say, a little bit. I would say she's someone who's quite hypervigilant, which I've inherited. Like she responds to loud noises. And I always remember she has the worst potty mouth. As a driver, she would often be like super preoccupied and absent-minded, like I've told you. So I'd be sitting in the car next to her, like being picked up from a friend's, and she'd be having whole conversations, almost rehearsing conversations out loud in the car with somebody who had annoyed her at work. And then suddenly the car in front might have to brake. And because she was half concentrating, she would then have to slam on the brakes really suddenly. And it would always be like effing and blinding, which was not like how she is the rest of the time, but effing and blinding at the person in front of her in a way that felt like bigger than the situation.
So not like your garden variety road rage.
I guess it was garden variety road rage, but it was also like, maybe you could be less preoccupied and you might not be shocked about, if someone is that preoccupied, they're having conversations with a person in their head about something that's happened at work. It wasn't like nonsensical conversations. It was,
you could hear her saying them out loud.
Yeah.
It's not just in her head.
Well, she'd be like doing gestures like this and, like talking. But like semi-loud, enough that I knew she was thinking about something way too much,
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. When was the definitive moment where it was like, okay, something is definitely not right.
Yeah.
Call the people and let's get this sorted.
Okay, that one's an easy one to answer. I shouldn't laugh, but we have a way of surviving these things.
If you don't laugh, you'll cry.
Yeah, really, really you will. So when did I know something was really wrong? Well, I think I was about 2006. I was in London. I'd finished school. I was probably a couple of years out of my A-levels. And I was doing music at the time. And I remember one day getting a call from my dad. And he said to me, your mother's not doing so well. And I think, would you like to speak to her? And I said to myself, my dad had had heart attacks and strokes. So in my head, I'm thinking, what's going on? Like, is it something physical? Is she having a heart attack? What's the deal? And he won't answer the question. He's just said, you speak to her. So my mum gets on the phone from Botswana and she's like, she says hello, but she sounds distant, like she's kind of not there, you know? It's like it's almost like she's saying hello to someone in another plane or something, you know? And I say to her, you know, how are you doing, Mum? And she kind of just, the phone's silent. I said, I heard you're not very well. Phone's kind of, you know, I can tell she's there, but she's not really saying much. And then suddenly she just goes, Alistair is dead. Now, Alistair's my brother, my elder brother. Like,
who's very much alive.
He's very much alive to this day, right? And she says, Alistair is dead. And my first christened name is Alison. And so then she goes, Alison is dead.
And you're very much alive.
And I was on the phone,
You're on the phone
to her, very much alive. So I'm like,
scary.
I was just like, what the hell is going on? Like, I didn't even have a language for this. I didn't know what this was. This is not the illness that I imagined when my dad said, your mum's not doing very well. So I was just kind of confused. And it transpired over the next couple of days that my dad was looking after her as the sole carer. And he was clearly like struggling to manage that process. And what happened over the coming days was that her kind of behaviors became less and less normal, quote unquote, and more extreme, I would say. So we live on this farm. She tried to break out of the house late at night. We have locks on everything. She tried to get to the gates at the end of the garden and escape that. She was erratic. She wasn't violent or anything like that, but her behavior was extremely erratic, and
it was very different from her regular behavior.
Very different. And one thing that was clear and plainly obvious to see over the next few days was she essentially didn't sleep for 7 days.
7 days?
Yeah, and I don't know if you know this, but a lack of sleep is strongly associated with psychosis. So it got to the point where my father was like, okay, I'm going to need to take her to the local hospital because I can't handle anything anymore. Now, he hadn't many choices. Our local hospital is it's in the village, maybe say 10 kilometers away. And in Botswana, we have just one mental health hospital, one dedicated mental hospital in the entire country.
One hospital for the entire nation. What's the population of Botswana?
It's probably close to 2 million now.
And you had
1.78
institution to deal with mental health.
One institution.
That's crazy.
In the south of the country, pretty far from where we live, like 3 hours drive from where we live. So he was like, I need to take her to that hospital, or not to that hospital, to our local hospital. And when she arrived there, the nurses medicated her with an injection, so something to try and get her to calm down and make her sleep. And it had basically no effect, which I've seen since. In fact, I saw it in my final stages of writing up my PhD. The same thing happened again. And they eventually said to my father, look, we have done everything we can. You have to take her to this one mental health hospital, which is called Lobatse. And Lobatse that's when I knew something serious is going on, because, I mean, I knew before that when we were getting her to the hospital. Lobatse is the kind of place we heard about growing up. It has almost like a legendary tale of foreboding status, right? It's like the kind of thing you're told as a kid, you don't want to end up in Lobatse because you'll never come out.
Yeah, we had that in Leeds. It was Roundhay Wing.
Oh,
you didn't want to get sent to Roundhay Wing, and it was a euphemism for you're not quite right.
Yeah.
Which it's not nice, but that was the euphemism.
That's the one we grew up with.
Yeah.
You're not quite right. And there was this thing is once you go there, you're never coming back out, or you're never coming back out the same.
Oh no, you could get out of Roundhay Wing.
you know that from experience?
No, I never went to Roundhay Wing, but I know that you could get out of it.
Why, did you meet many an escapee?
Not an escapee, but I know people who had to go to Roundhay Wing.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
And this stuff is common. It's just that people don't talk about it because of the stigma.
There's so much stigma with mental health, regardless of race. There's a huge stigma with mental health. So what were the conditions like in Lobatse?
Oh, well, I was over here in England. So I think as soon as I realised she had to go there, and my dad, who must have been in his 70s at the time, was not really coping very well on his own. Like, he wasn't feeding himself because he's worried about her. I was like, I need to get a flight back home in a hurry. I basically made the decision to go home as quickly as possible, which was honestly pure chaos for a whole bunch of reasons.
Because you were on the other side of the planet.
Yeah. No, I was in UK and I needed to get home ASAP. And so my dad and I drove to the hospital the first day after I got back, which was like a 3-hour drive. And that place, honestly, the first thing that happened, we parked up the car and the hospital is kind of in this compound, or it was, there's a new one now, split into 2 parts. And in one wing, there's a wing of people that basically are there for a long time and probably aren't getting out, or they're in like a high state of distress and needing medication to quite a high degree. And then there's another wing, which ended up being the wing where you go before you get released. As we were walking towards these buildings the first time, I remember walking a few steps behind my dad and seeing this old man. And he just took one look at me and like fixated onto me and started walking towards me. And I looked down and the guy's fly was open. And I just remember thinking, stay close to your father and walk. Like, I'm not trying to create stigma, but I was quite young. I wasn't even 20 yet.
Yeah, I'm not even going to ask what he was doing with his fly opens. I think we can...
You can guess. But I was just like, my first thing was, where the hell has my mom been brought to? And then, of course, we got taken to the wing where the most distressed and, for want of a better word, disturbed people were. And I walked into that wing as my second thing I saw in there. And the beds were like these old metal beds that, you know the ones you see in those films of the Second World War where there's like a matron like nursing a soldier who's been in armed combat. Yeah, exactly. The beds were like that. And they were less than a meter from each other. And a patient could just, or like a service user, as we call them here, could just touch the person next to them. There was one person who was chained to the bed. Chained, which to me was just, what am I seeing? And then, of course, there were other people who had clearly been given something to calm them down and were so out of it because they were on medication that was just intended to basically knock them out.
Wow. So you see your mum in this space for the first time.
Yeah.
What is she like? What's going through your mind?
I mean, she was like the people I described in the sense that she was out of it. You know, she was there, but she was not there. Like, she would respond. She sort of basically recognized you, but not the person I know. Like, just very much dulled senses, dulled interactions, slow responses. So we're on the phone.
And that's the first time you'd seen her in that condition.
Yeah, definitely.
That was the first episode.
And it was a massive switch from before the flight, where I was on the phone to someone who seemed very agitated and obviously thought her children had died.
So what were you feeling when you saw your mum like that? Because that can't be easy to see your mum in that condition, not just in that condition in terms of herself, but in that space that is in that condition.
Yeah, I'm not sure I had very much thought or emotion for myself at that time. My main thought was, how the hell do I get her out of here? Because I don't see how you recover in here. That was my preoccupation. What is happening here? When is she getting out? How do we fix this?
Your researcher brain took over.
My researcher brain is always there.
So, were there any professionals in the space that you had to interact with? Because at the moment, it's just giving World War II madness and mayhem, excuse the pun.
Yeah, there were professional. Well, to be fair, I only remember one of them. I'm sure there were nurses around. I remember one doctor, a psychiatrist, and I can't remember if I told you this, but there are only 7 of them in Botswana. There's one hospital
7.
and there's 7 psychiatrists in the entire country. So as you can imagine, there is not a lot of time with professional staff in this space. I met this psychiatrist once. We met him after my mum had been moved to the other ward, the transitionary ward, before discharge. And he called us into his office, me, my father, and my mum, when we were visiting. And he said, okay, I want to speak to you about your mum, or your wife in my dad's case. Do you know what the problem is or what may have caused this? My dad's reply was, you know, I've been watching my wife. At the time before her admittance, she had been doing her PhD. She was writing up. She had also been called to sit on a government commission into corruption. And in the days leading up to her breakdown, she had felt under pressure to lie under oath, and she felt bullied by the person that was in charge of that commission. And as someone who speaks the truth no matter what and doesn't really tend to lie about what she sees, that made her extremely uptight and anxious. And she wasn't prepared to do it. It was like interrupted her values. So what was happening was she was sitting on the commission, coming home, writing her PhD, and she didn't sleep for 7 days. So that was my dad's theory about why things happened. Very much, here were the circumstances before. And in that interaction, he also looked at me and said, do you know why it's happened? And I gave a slightly different answer to my dad. Mine was, you know, I think she's been through a lot. She's gone through all sorts of traumas that have never been addressed. I thought it was interesting that she had said Alistair and Alison are dead. I know that she carried a child to full term and then had a stillborn child, and that never got really talked about. So I was like, is that some kind of thing coming back? Her father had died when she was 7 years old. She had been incredibly close to him. She wasn't told that he had died when she was told he was sleeping. You know, there were all these kinds of things that I knew, and I felt like those were parts of the reasons. And I said that to him. And I guess that was the conversation I had with him at the time.
How did he respond?
His response was very interesting because he was like, well, how do you know all this about your mother? And my reply to him was like, I just know. It's like God tells me. Ooh. And yeah, when you say, ooh, that was basically, he looked alarmed when I said that. And he looked at my father, who had given this very like dispassionate Englishman answer. And he looked at me, and I'd given him this kind of spiritual answer. And he looked back at my dad like, she's next.
Wow.
Yeah. Even my dad sort of did a sharp intake of breath and got tense by the way the doctor looked at him.
So the psychiatrist is basically getting red flags from you.
Yeah.
Based off of the fact that you're the daughter of your mum who's going through this episode.
I don't know whether it was that he was thinking about if the mum has it, she might be next. Or what I felt like was this was a medical doctor who was a black doctor who in Africa, where I wouldn't have thought he would bat an eyelid about me referencing God or something spiritual, he was just, I don't know whether it was the religious piece of it, but he seemed to be highly skeptical that you could just know, or what I think is intuition.
So then what treatment did he then prescribe your mum? How did that sort of work out?
I mean, he did what happens to most people in Botswana. There aren't people to offer talking therapy or anything other than medical. So she was given drugs, basically, antipsychotic drugs. And she tells me, and I can observe, that she is much better on a whole range of measures because of those drugs. But then the flip side of it is she says she doesn't feel like herself as a result of taking those drugs. And one of the big things was that she always talked about growing up that she received visits from her father in dreams, and now she no longer has them. And the thing about those dreams was, for her, when her father visited her, it was usually in times of distress or difficulty, and he would give her wisdom and she felt at peace. So the drugs have taken away for her one of the main sources of comfort and connection to her spiritual and ancestral sense of self. You know, they've taken it from her.
Yeah. It's so interesting because I come from an African context, But because of the very stringent Pentecostal Christianity that I grew up with, someone saying that anybody visits you in the dream, it's like demon.
Exactly.
Witches, wizards, monitoring spirits that have come to do harm to you in the dream. It's not seen as a good thing. Whereas our indigenous practices, that is a good thing. Like that ancestral link, right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting that the doctor, because we don't know, do we know the religion of the doctor?
So it could be that he was a religious Christian man, for example, or it could be that he was a medical scientist.
Yeah.
But either
and
way,
everything has to be logical and provable by science.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But however, regardless, both of those are quite colonial outlooks. Yeah. So this kind of secular scientific modern medicine that has no room for religion in a medical model is a colonial import. And a form of religiosity, of Christian religion, is also, that makes what was there before demonic, is also colonial. Whatever way you look at it, they're colonial imports, right? Either you have a medical model doctor who has this very secular practice of medicine inherited from Europeans, or you may have religious fervor Christianity that has no room for indigenous, but even that was imported. And so anybody who had those pre-colonial indigenous beliefs is now seen as strange.
Yeah.
Or it's something to be medicated or seen as abnormal in some way.
Absolutely.
A delusion, maybe, if you're a doctor, or a demon, if you're a religious person.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Because I find, you know what it is, in this crazy world that we live in, and essentially it's driven by capitalism, right? This need for everybody to be super productive all the time, toeing the line and being good little cogs in the wheel. Anything that disrupts that has to be fixed.
Yeah.
And that fixing is in the form of medication to keep you going.
To numb you out. To make you lose disconnection from yourself, which may be screaming at you, no, I don't want to lie like a cog on the wheel of this government commission to preserve a system that maintains capitalism or whatever else, right?
It's directly at odds with your spirit.
Yeah.
But then you being in tune with your spirit makes you at odds with the system.
Yeah.
And so the system goes, here's a drug.
Yeah.
Don't think about that. Just get on with it because we've got to keep making money. That's crazy. It's kind of crazy to me that there's only one psychiatric hospital in the country and only 7 psychiatrists. And obviously that then reduces capacity, like you said, for any alternative therapies beyond medication. Because I feel like in the UK, you would be offered other therapies alongside the medication. In terms of like talking therapies and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. However, I would say this, for Black people in the UK, it's quite different. We know that white people are more likely to be referred for talking therapy than Black people. But even when we get talking therapy here, it's often not culturally sensitive or appropriate. So you may be talking to a white therapist who you're now tiptoeing, can I mention God? Can I mention this? If I start tapping my head in the therapy session, am I going to be seen as self-harming? You know, so this is the kind of stuff I see in the work I've been doing around Black mental health through research, right? These people are scared to access therapy because they don't know how they will be received or read and whether they'll be seen as normal or sick.
And that's the thing, which is why we need more Black and brown therapists.
Yeah.
You know, psychotherapists. And I guess that's why organizations like the Black, African and Asian Therapy Network is really, really important. And we can link to that in the show description.
So anyway, talk to me about your mum. Because at the top of this episode, you talked about an experience that she had and we didn't get into it. And I want to know about that.
My mum. God bless her. She caught COVID during the pandemic and caught it really, really badly. And it kind of affected her speech patterns and her perception of things and the world. And so she got really bad, was rushed to hospital and ended up on a red COVID ward because they had created these wards specifically for COVID.
Yeah.
And I was actually in London at the time, and I had to rush back up, went straight to the ward, and they were like, nobody can come onto these wards. It's just not allowed.
Yeah.
And I was just very persistent. I said, I have to see my mum because I need to know that she's okay. Probably shouldn't have done that, but I did. And I think as time went on, because they were having so much trouble with her, they were overworked, not enough staff, probably underpaid, if I'm being honest.
It was a wild time, COVID.
It was wild.
Yeah.
And I think after a while, I think they put 2 and 2 together and thought, well, if she's going to come onto this ward and care for her mum and calm her down, because they made it clear that she wasn't cooperating.
Okay.
And I think they did 2 and 2 and said, well, we should probably just let her on to the ward.
But what did that not cooperating look like? When you say they were having trouble with her?
Well, they were just, it was those kind of words, those sort of couch terms, like she's not cooperating, it's not easy, they're struggling, it's a challenge, those kind of words. And so they let me on the ward and they said, look, if you get COVID, it's on you. We take no liability. You're doing this of your own volition, fully aware of what the potential outcome could be for yourself, health-wise. I said, fine, I just want to see my mum, let me on the ward. So they did. And I remember I went into the room that she was in, and the condition that I saw my mum in is a condition that nobody should ever see their mum in. I took one look at her, and I'm not going to describe it because I do want to preserve her dignity, but it was very, very bad. And I went through the door, saw her in that condition, and I broke down crying. I just stood there, I was just crying. I was just like, Mum, Mummy, you know?
Yeah.
And the nurse was there and she just looked at me. She looked at my mum. It was almost like saying, you were supposed to come and help, not hinder.
Yeah.
You there crying like a baby and your mum's here, you know? Aww. But she managed to get my mum to understand that I was there.
Okay, so she didn't recognize you.
It was like she couldn't, it was like she just couldn't process. And I went into the room, the nurse kind of comforted me, said, it's going to be all right, don't worry, there's your mum, just talk to her, you know. Anyway, I managed to get myself under control, become composed, talk to her, managed to get her to go back to her bed because she had pulled her IV out at this point and all of this stuff. And she was like trying to, essentially as soon as I came into the room and saw her, I realized what she was trying to do. Once I'd composed myself, I realized what she was trying to do. So my mum has quite a strong prayer routine. It's unlike anything that most people would understand. Even the people in her church don't fully understand why she prays to the extremes that she does. But it's like she can pray for 10 hours a day. Oh. There's certain positions she needs to be in when she prays, like certain sort of kneeling positions. It sounds like torture here, but it's not torture.
Like basically you mean off the bed.
It's
right?
off the bed and into a position that makes sense for her.
Yeah.
And she was trying to get into that position, but she couldn't because the IV was there. She was getting tangled up in it, but she has to stick to this routine because as far as she's concerned, that is an arrangement that she has made with God as a commitment and a promise to him to pray in that way for those certain hours of the day. So I managed to get her to understand you can't do that here right now. What you need to do is be in the bed because you're pulling out the IV and the IV needs to stay in. And she's like, but I need to pray. I need to read my Bible. I need to do these things. None of this had been communicated to the nurses. They had just made an assumption that because she was praying, but they didn't understand the kind of prayer, that she was being uncooperative and maybe there was a mental health issue there. Right. They weren't sure.
Yeah, because they're just seeing a ripped out IV.
Yeah.
They're seeing someone who won't stay in bed when they're clearly unwell. Okay.
Exactly. So in that moment, I was like, okay, well, I know my mum. I know the thing that calms her always is music and gospel music.
Yeah.
So I got my iPod out, which already had a playlist of gospel music, and I just put the gospel music on loop, on loud, and put it by the bed. And I got her Bible and I opened it out and I put it near her on the bed and I got her into the bed and the music calmed her down. Yeah. And then I was able to explain to her, look, they don't understand what it is you're trying to do. You're not going to be able to do it in the way that you want to do it for now. But what I need you to do is stay in the bed, keep your IV in, but you can still pray and listen to your music here. And then she calmed down. And I think the nurses were really happy because it was another thing off their shoulders.
Yeah.
And I ended up just staying on that ward for a week with her.
Wow.
Going back and forth, getting her stuff, making sure she had all her prayer things, leaving the music on loop, all of that good stuff, and just basically taking care of her on this COVID ward. But that was a moment where I saw quite clearly religion colliding with the health system.
Yeah.
And it being interpreted as a mental health issue.
Yeah, totally. I mean, one of the things I guess our NHS is full of migrant workers, right? African doctors.
The nurse was Filipino.
Okay, Filipino. Yeah, there are a lot of Filipino nurses in this country. Thank God for Filipino nurses and many other kinds of nurses.
I thank them very much, because I felt like she didn't, I got the feeling that she didn't feel like it was
an issue.
As big an issue as the white nurses. But the head nurse was a white woman.
Okay.
And you
like
can't challenge, like a matron, you know?
Yeah.
So what she says dictates what goes on and how things really are kind of taken on board.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good example, and I've heard similar kinds of stories. And I think what I find so fascinating is the connection between both our mothers' stories. Like, your mum was seeking comfort in a time of distress.
With her God. She was seeking comfort from her God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was being, in some ways, kept from her and denied her and not understood. And I feel like a very similar thing kind of happens with my mum, where she's gone through this awful thing in her life, and this medication is keeping her from the source of comfort that she has, which is her father appearing as an ancestor to her.
Yeah. I find it so sad because there's also another side to it where it's like, how could those nurses be expected to understand my mum's complicated and regimental prayer
ritual? Yeah.
It doesn't, even if you're a Christian, hers is a different kind anyway. Even to the people in her church, it's quite stringent.
That's an interesting one. So the people in her church is quite stringent. So would they recognize it as a expression of faith, or do they also think that do you think they might think there's some sort of mental health component to it with her?
No, they recognize it as faith.
Yeah.
They see my mum as a very faithful woman, a woman of God whose faith is just next level in terms of her ability to do these kind of very involved prayer routines.
Yeah.
It's almost seen as like a great discipline.
Exactly.
Like a prophet.
Unwavering.
Unwavering, like the prophets of old, you know, from the Old Testament. So no, I don't think they would see that in that way.
I think the other thing that I find interesting about your mum's story is that you would expect in normal times there would be chaplains on the wards in hospitals. And I don't know if they just weren't around with COVID, but you would expect them to be... The chaplains, I know they act as like some kind of translator between the patient who may be religious and the medical staff who may not necessarily understand it. So
I think the thing is, even if the chaplain had come, would he have understood the kind of prayer that my mum was doing?
I can already say from the research spaces I've been around chaplaincy in this country, no, because first of all, chaplaincy in this country is very much white, very much Anglican, and very much a British reading, a very white reading of Christianity. Not to mention how few Muslim chaplains there are, Sikh chaplains. So there's a whole bunch of people who just wouldn't be catered to. But you'd think, like, maybe something, but I guess.
But this is why so many of us in our communities have a very deep and ingrained distrust of the medical systems.
Yeah.
Because we're not understood. And that misunderstanding leads to a pathologizing of us.
Yeah.
And that pathologizing stays with you. Because once you get that section, so we have something called a section in this country where you'll be able to define it a bit better, but...
Marginally, but essentially the police have powers to detain you under section, I think 135 of the Mental Health Act, if you are a danger to yourself or to the people around you because of a mental health issue.
Yeah.
So you can be taken in essentially against your will.
And once that happens, that's a big stigma.
Yeah.
That goes on your record and it follows you around. pretty much everywhere you go. So we want to avoid that, because already as Black people, we are overrepresented in the mental health system.
Massively overrepresented.
Considering that we're only 3.5% of the population.
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
So what about in the church? How do you feel like they dealt with mental health issues? Obviously, they didn't read your mum as mentally unwell, but were there other examples or?
The church is an interesting one, because I feel like in the church, the lines get very blurred, because one of the standard things that you will see in most churches is, I was speaking to God and God told me this.
Yeah.
God spoke.
100%.
Thus says
That's
the Lord.
basically what I said to my mum's psychiatrist, right?
Yeah.
Like, God told me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, when you think about that in just regular society's view of things, it sounds like you're hearing voices. It could appear that you are hearing voices, because actually we can't see the God that you said spoke to you to do this thing. So therefore you must be hearing voices. So the lines are quite blurred. And I also find that the lines can get blurred when it comes to certain expressions of worship and prayer. So I remember growing up as a kid, we would have these all-night services that were prayer focused. So you'd be praying all night, which is a long time to pray.
Yeah.
And there was an uncle, let's just call him Brother Andy.
Okay.
And when he would pray, his prayer was very physical, which is not abnormal in our services, because it's like fire and brimstone, and you use your whole body to purge the devil and repel the witches and wizards from you and your family and your future generations. That's just what it is. But his was different, because he would do all those physical gestures, punch in the air, jerky movements, but at the same time, loads of snot.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I know. Huge amounts of snot and spit would be there. And, you know, we had these plastic chairs that had like a bit of a dip towards the sort of bum area. And he'd be sort of bent over this chair, and that whole area would just be full of snot, saliva, and all these horrible things. I know, so it's gross. Grim. I should have given you a trigger warning.
No.
But that, and that would happen all the time. And us kids would just be looking at him side-eye, like nudging each other, like, oh, he's at it again. The aunties would come with like huge wads of tissue to try and push into the chair.
Oh, that's so grim.
The brothers, the uncles in the church would sort of try and tap him, like, you know, my guy, it's a bit too much now.
Just calm down a
bit. There's prayer and there's prayer. Yours is
the wrong side of prayer.
It's the wrong side. Organize yourself. You know? Yeah. But that's a blurred line, because actually when I think back on it now, as a kid, it was just like, oh, there's Brother Andy being weird again.
Yeah.
But now I look back on it, I'm like, to me, that is poor mental health. Something is going on in him for him to lose all control of his faculties and not have any self-awareness of how to conduct himself in that public space, because it's still a public space.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting take on it, because essentially what you're saying, I was sitting there thinking, but is it poor mental health? I mean, essentially what we're saying is Brother Andy didn't do what was socially acceptable and normal. And so then we start getting into this blurred line of when is a mental health diagnosis or, you know, describing someone as mentally ill about socially conforming and about control. Do you know what I mean?
Okay, but let me put this to you. If you were on a bus and somebody started just doing snot and spit and
trust me,
everywhere,
it's an issue I would have.
I don't know any society on the face of the planet, from the jungles of wherever to the cities of wherever, where that would be considered normal. No, your bodily fluids, generally speaking, should stay inside your body.
No, I really, especially some of them. But I have to say that there is something about that, though, right? That there's something. I'm sure your read on Brother Andy and him capturing your attention said something. But like, there is definitely some component of societal norms and control that goes on.
Absolutely, because I feel like, you know, every society has its cultural mores and rules and norms that governs how we exist together. And that's what makes a society strong. It makes it safe. It makes it balanced and all of those good things. And so if you aren't able to fit those norms for whatever reason, then you are at odds with that society. And I think some of the things that we are, particularly as Black people, particularly if you're recently arrived, you might be at odds with them because that society doesn't understand what you're doing.
Yeah.
And you might not even know how to, or that you've even broken it, because a lot of these rules are unwritten or unspoken. They've just been there for
100%.
hundreds of years.
They're social norms. People aren't even aware that they are rules if they've lived in that society.
Hence, you can do the whirling dervish in one society, but you do it in the city centre and they're going to send you to round day wings.
Sections. It's true. Okay, one thing I am curious about, only because I've heard so many stories of this from research. In your church, did you ever have examples of people who presented with what looked like a mental health issue, who were treated as being like almost possessed or having like a demon spirit or anything like that?
100%.
Oh, really? So what kind of things happened?
I'm just going to call her Auntie Zed.
Okay.
I loved her. And I'll never forget that day when my mum got the call that something wasn't right with Auntie Zed. And, you know, my mum took me everywhere. So we got in the car to Auntie Zed's house and we turned up and she just looked different. You know, when you said you spoke to your mum and she sounded distant, Auntie Zed looked distant.
Yes.
She couldn't, it was like you're looking at her, but she's looking through you.
Yep, exactly. I know that looks so well.
You know?
Yeah.
And then she was just sort of muttering to herself and talking to herself. And she was just, it was like a shell of the Auntie Zed that I know.
Yeah.
You know? So that was one example. And my mum was like, it's the devil. The devil has got a hold of Auntie Zed and we are going to bind him and cast him out.
Oh.
And so the prayer started.
Oh, how many
now,
hours did this go on for?
Auntie Zed's husband was a white Englishman.
Oh.
Upper middle class white Englishman.
Really?
Auntie Zed, by the way, was a Black woman.
Okay.
And he was just like, yeah, that's... Well, no, he wasn't. He was all right. Well, that's... I understand that she does like to go to the church. However, I'm going to call the hospital.
Oh.
And that was it. He was not having any of it. He allowed us a bit of prayer and then she was gone to go and get some actual medical treatment. So that was an example of, you know, the church meeting the system head on in this one house.
Yeah.
And that struggle between them.
Yeah, but I mean, in a way, I see what you're saying because the system would support the same medical kind of approach that the husband did. But in a way, it's also like sometimes we in our churches won't acknowledge a mental health issue as an issue. No. And the person gets stigmatized for being demon possessed or something, when actually they do just need good treatment, culturally appropriate treatment. So in a way, her husband was protective.
Absolutely.
Of her.
Yeah.
In a way, I think my dad has been protective of my mum. Had she, you know, not married him and presented with those symptoms, I think she would have been like a lot of her siblings, where she never, ever would have presented to mental health services to get treatment that she accepts she needs, even if it makes her feel like it's not quite right for her or the dose makes her disconnected from herself.
Yeah. And maybe, God forbid, but maybe she would still be in Lobatse.
No, for real. I think she would have presented much later and maybe it would have been very hard to recover, you know, and that's a really common story here too. Black people present way later to mental health services. They're far more likely to have serious diagnoses like schizophrenia because often we don't trust the system to go when the symptoms are less severe and we don't trust that they will truly help us.
Because historically, they haven't.
No, they really haven't. I mean... This is a very, very brutal system that from its inception has created, this is back to the power thing, right? You know, I don't know if you know about this, but runaway slaves were given a diagnosis. Do you know about that?
Tell me about it.
Runaway slaves were given a diagnosis of drapetomania and they were perceived to be mentally unwell when they tried to escape their slave master. Now, if that doesn't tell you how much this is wrapped up in power control. And maybe that's not about norms. It's like you won't fit into the box and the position we've ascribed you as slave. And you are going to resist this. And now your resistance must be something abnormal, a problem, a sign of your delinquence. And we must control you by medicating you.
And I see that even now under these systems that we're in that overwork us, burn us out. And when you present with symptoms, rather than like we were
like
talking
anxiety
earlier,
and depression.
Yeah, like
right?
we were talking earlier with our trainer and just this idea that it's a profoundly unhealthy, sick world. Mm-hmm. And to be adapted to that is not normal. Yeah. It's actually more normal to have a reaction to how crazy and sick this world is.
Yeah, yeah.
And yet you're diagnosed as having all of these things. It's all pathologized, and we're going to give you pills to, like we said, to numb you out so that you get on with the job of being a productive cog in the system and not challenging the powers that be.
Exactly. And whatever power structure it may be, the aim is that some people should not be challenging it. I think it's everywhere, from people sick now because of capitalism to women who were sick of patriarchy and sexual assault and were given diagnoses of hysteria and nowadays borderline personality disorder because they're adjusting to something else that's oppressing them. You know, there's so many examples of this. And it's like, at what point are these systems harmful rather than healing? Like that line is also blurred. I know, for example, my mum says, I know I need my medication and I'm glad I have it, but there is a point at which it's also not helping you or not seeing you.
Absolutely. I mean, you listed a lot of traumas that your mum's been through. And I often think to myself, I wonder if she'd had a therapist from young, if maybe this wouldn't even be the case. Just an ability to heal in a more healthy, humane and holistic way.
Yeah, I've thought that a lot myself. It's one reason when I started to have like difficulties emotionally at a certain point in my life, I was like, I'm going to therapy because I don't want to end up in that place. And thank God that was hugely helpful for me. But also it was hugely helpful because I had a Black woman therapist.
That part, me
and
too.
I could afford it.
Me too.
I could afford it. You have to be able to afford.
Yeah, absolutely. So what is the data on Black people in the mental health system?
I mean, it's not pretty. We're massively overrepresented in the mental health system. We're also much more represented in the most severe, I would say, the secure end of mental health services. So what that means is the spaces where there's more likely to be police involved, where there's more potential for coercion and people going into a service not by their choice, against their will sometimes. We are, as I said, like much more likely to have a serious mental health diagnosis than our white counterparts. So things like schizophrenia. So for example, I did some work around Black mental health in Haringey. And I know that Black and global majority heritage, so brown people, were on the ward 4 times longer than their white counterparts.
Wow.
So once we're inside, we stay longer as well.
No, that's crazy. That's really crazy and quite sobering and saddening.
Yeah.
Thinking about everything we've spoken about and the work that you've done in the space, what do you see as an effective treatment approach for minoritized people in, I guess, any given society? Because you could be a white person in a society where you are a minority as well.
That's true. And it's a really good question. You could also be a white person in this country and be a Christian and have difficulty with this system.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, help.
So, for example, I remember doing a presentation about my mum's experiences, but they were actually anonymized, to a group of chaplains who worked in hospitals once. And there was one chaplain, a guy, who said to me that everything I had described about my mum's experience, he saw every day working in mental health services, white Christian people included, who invoked God's name and were seen as unwell.
Oh, wow.
Because the medical model is often associated with non-religiosity.
That's true.
Or secularism. It merges at the time of the Enlightenment, when religion and God as an idea is falling out of favor in Europe, right? So all sorts of things get coded into those norms as well.
If you had told me that white people were also stigmatized for their Christian beliefs, I would not have known that.
I mean, I think it's, anything seen as non-normative or abnormal in a system can be seen as a sign of sickness. Right?
Are they punished as heavily?
I don't know that I have any data on that, but what I know was that person told me in his experience, this is something that everybody needs to pay attention to because it's really common. But what I do think, though, when you come back to your question of what should treatment look like for minoritized people, the bottom line is we also know that looking visibly different is not going to help. So it's not just the words you say or the faith you express. If you say it in a certain body, you're probably going to face more judgment, more concern, more all sorts of things. And how do we deal with that? I don't think there's simple answers. I definitely don't know that I have them. But I don't think it's about saying the medical model is all wrong and people shouldn't be taking medication and we always need to find alternatives. Clearly, a lot of people want, are reliant on and benefit from medication.
Definitely.
My mum included.
Definitely.
I have that conversation with her. We have a dialogue about that. But at the same time, you should not be going to a place to heal and be told that your culture, your religion, everything that makes you you, everything that brings you comfort is potentially indicative of sickness.
Yeah.
And that would need treatment.
Yeah.
At that point, what you're reinforcing is racism, cultural racism, spiritual racism, whatever it is, you're reinforcing it. So we need to find a balance. We need healthcare practitioners, wherever they are from, to be educated about a whole range of worldviews, values, belief systems, things they may not have grown up around, to understand how they show up in us, in our behavior, and to be able to talk to a person in talking therapy or during treatment in a way that they can understand each other.
And also in a way that's curious, asking questions rather than making assumptions.
Yeah.
But then I get it, because a lot of these health professionals, you know, they're also in systems, particularly when you think about the NHS, our National Health Service, where they are overworked, they are underpaid, they're having to deal with a high volume of patients, massive waiting lists. So it's like, I just need to get this person done in 10 minutes and out, next person 10 minutes and out.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult one. It really is.
It's really rough what healthcare workers are facing. And the examples we've used, for example, have been like your mum.
Yeah.
During COVID.
Yeah.
That was a time when everyone in the health system was under unbelievable stress.
Yeah, and all we did was clap for them.
Oh, yeah. Nobody got a pay rise, but they all got a clap because our Prime Minister said that we should.
Yeah. So I think across the board, we really need better education, but also better systems that are better for both the patient and for the person administering the care.
Yeah, 100%. Couldn't agree more.
So I want to go back to that psychiatrist and his reaction to you when you demonstrated something. You kind of said, it's God. And then he gave you that look like you might be next. If you did have that, would you see it as a gift or a curse? And do you feel like he was right or wrong?
Wow, that's a big question. Okay, so the first part, do I think it's a gift to just intuitively know certain things? I kind of don't. But the reason is, I think most human beings have a deep intuition about the world and about the people around them. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think we always pick up intuitively things about the people around us. And I think a lot of the time we are taught not to see those things.
Yeah.
Often as very young children.
Yeah, because it's irritating to the adults. It's too revealing.
Yeah.
They've kind of hit the nail on the head about something that's quite close to the bone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got into trouble a lot as a kid because I said things I wasn't supposed to see, whether it was naming racism or whatever. It got me in trouble because I said I was saying what I thought was obvious, you know. No, I'm not saying everything I knew was intuition. I'm sure I maybe heard my mum's stories and also just forgot hearing them. And then I had them as a kind of knowing about her. I think a lot of people have it. I think it can be a curse if you have a gift and you don't know how to use it wisely, because I think the system, whether a family system or a public system, the penalties can be very harsh.
Oh, yeah.
For knowing and saying what you see.
Absolutely.
Or think or feel.
Yeah. Because it disrupts the social cohesion, in quotes.
Yeah, exactly. That part. What was the second part of your question?
Do you think he was wrong or right?
I think he was definitely wrong. And the reason why is not because he didn't help, but because I think it goes back to what you just said. That was the moment for a doctor to be curious. And what he showed on his face was a degree of anxiety, fear, or judgment. Whether that was rooted in him having Christian beliefs, whether it was rooted in having non-religious beliefs and he was just a medic, scientific of a particular persuasion. He could have said, when you say God tells you, what do you mean? Curiosity is what I said
it's
earlier.
What you said. Be more curious, ask more questions.
Yeah.
Even if it takes a little bit longer.
Yeah. It was a moment for dialogue between us. And probably he would have pulled out of me, well, my mum said this, and, you know, I know my mum went through this trauma or that trauma. How do you know? Well, God told me, maybe she told me, but also maybe I don't know what I would have answered, but I'm quite sure whatever his instinctive shock reaction was, it would have dissipated a bit if we had come to understand each other.
Better curiosity, more openness is needed.
Yeah.
That was a big episode,
yeah.
But it was good to talk about that with you, I think, because we've been affected by this religion, mental health thing in very different ways. Mine from like a very Christian perspective, and yours from more of an Indigenous perspective, Indigenous religious perspective. But it was good to really get to grips with that. And
what would you want for your mum's treatment, by the way?
My mum doesn't take pills. That's the thing. So even if you gave her, even if you prescribed all of the medication in the world, she's not going to take it. So the only thing left really is something that is more rooted in talking. I wish there was a more Christian type of way for her to process whatever it is that she needs to process. She doesn't like therapy, but you find with that generation of Africans and Caribbeans, they don't, because it's like putting your dirty laundry out there to someone that you don't know, a complete stranger. So she didn't really respond very well to talking therapies either for that reason. But yet when she talks to me, she goes deep. But the thing is, I can't be her therapist because
you're her
I'm your
daughter.
daughter. That's the problem. So in an ideal world, it would be some sort of talking therapy or something that's a bit more embedded in her faith that she can accept more easily. You know, it used to be, I remember back in the day, you'd have counselling with your pastor and you'd go for counselling, you'd book counselling sessions with him. I don't know whether that happens anymore.
No, there are. This is back to the culturally appropriate. I've always said you need therapists to be theologically literate in a range of traditions, but also to have therapists trained who are in the church.
Yes.
Right? What would it mean if the pastor actually got training as a therapist?
It'd be brilliant.
It would be amazing.
Yeah. And a few elders as well, trusted elders who could also do, so it's not all on the pastor.
Yeah.
So they can all deliver it. But yeah, that's what I would say for my mum.
Yeah, I think it's needed.
Yeah. Well, that brings us to the close. Thank you so much. If you want to reach out to us, you can get us at rigorandflow@gmail.com. That's rigor, RIGOUR, ANDFLOW@gmail.com. If you have any questions about the episode, any thoughts, any feedback, anything you'd like us to talk about in a future episode that's not even to do with the theme of this episode, definitely reach out because we will be answering your questions in a subsequent episode. And we would love to talk about the things that you want to hear us talk about.